Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, from IDEAS and from IPDET family. Bienvenue à tous et un grand merci à l'Université Carleton, au CRDI, à la Banque mondiale et à IPDET d'avoir organisé ce panel. This anniversary panel is entitled Building the Field of Development Evaluation for the Next 10 Years, Learning Across North and South. This theme is important to all of us. And we have today with us three distinguished actors in the field of development evaluation. The panel will unfold as follows. I will have each of our speakers present their views on two questions that we've set up for the panel. Namely, what are the key challenges that the development evaluation face for the next decade? After their presentation, we will have a brief interaction among the panelists, and then we will open the floor to discussions. So without any further delay, I will ask Dr. Chinery-Hesse at my right to start her presentation.
Good afternoon. I think it is fair to say that evaluation as a science has come of age. I want to say that we have overcome a large number of definitional issues now. We now tend to speak the same language. And I think as a profession, evaluation has emerged. It's not quite law or engineering, but certainly it has become a discipline which can be identified as such. And I think this is important to say. I think the emergence has also been aided very much by the emergence of professional evaluation associations, also communities of practice. In Africa, we confer a lot by internet, and in that way, we manage to learn from each other's examples. And I think this is something which needs to be encouraged, the kind of networking which will make us relate to each other and not reinvent the wheel all the time, but build on each other's successes and learn from each other's failures as well. And I think a forum such as this one presents a platform for this sort of networking. It has to be encouraged. But we have to make sure that we continue to train good evaluation people. I know that many times we confuse people with competence in statistical methods of social research with evaluators. I think that they are not necessarily evaluators. We need to upgrade their skills, give them the competencies to be able to carry out the evaluation function. As we have counted on institutions and centers such as IPDET to assist us in consciously nurturing a supply of evaluators who can effectively cover different thematic disciplines. It then behoves our public administrations to ensure that there's a clear career path, adequately remunerated, in order to guarantee retention of such trained personnel. We cannot take the sustainability for granted, because if you keep training and you don't pay properly, the trained people will wander. They will seek greener pastures, and who can blame them? So this is now talking about the future. I hope we will take this very seriously and make sure that we avoid this sort of brain drain. Curiously, some donors who support training programs such as this one are among those who cause the brain drain, because they recruit the best so they are not available to governments. I just want to say that practice should stop. Let's train, let's retain, and let's make sure that the skills are upgraded, and this is it. I also want to say that it is an uphill task for one person to create institutional change, and therefore we should continue to train more and more people so there will be a critical mass of professionals working as a team in the same organization. Many of those who have been trained here will probably not have a very strong voice because theirs will be a lone voice. We also have to make sure that the evaluation function itself is placed high enough in government that it is taken seriously. I was just talking to the Director General for Evaluation of Botswana, and they have just moved the evaluation function to the presidency. I would hope that this would happen more and more. But in Africa in particular, I have to confess that within the context of the myriad of pressures which we have on governments to provide all sorts of improvements in the quality of life of people, evaluation can easily be given a backseat. When you have to make decisions about how to use resources, and education is there, health is there, etc. It's very difficult in tough times not to see evaluation as a luxury, but that is very dangerous for us. And because of that, it is important that we carry out an advocacy program. And I think this function should be carried out by people like you who are coming out. We all have to be part of the process of letting policymakers understand that it is important to have the evaluation function as an integral part of government. However, the profession will have to earn that. And in addition, the evaluation function sometimes is handled in such a manner that reports which are generated are not timely. By the time the reports are out, they are dated, and then they are shelved. These are practical issues which, having worked in government, has been very obvious to me. I also want to say that in Africa, for example, we should make sure that even we just don't put the evaluation function at the most appropriate place. I think the function would have come of age if it is raised to cabinet status. And I think it's important because without a robust development evaluation infrastructure, the kind of accelerated growth we are looking for in Africa will not happen. But we do the advocacy as well. So what I would end by saying is that it's a tough world, you see, and we need to know that we are on the right track. When you cannot afford money, is when you should not waste it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chinery-Hesse, for raising some very good insights. And we will now have Mr. Naidoo present his views.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a few points which I'll structure around the key questions. The first is there's been changes in power relations and fundamental changes in terms of how development is done, and we need to ask ourselves, what are the implications of this for evaluation? What has been the impact of globalization on the discipline? Has it changed the imperatives for monitoring and evaluation? And then what are the implications in terms of resources And looking forward, what does this all mean in terms of evaluation and evaluator competencies? So a few points that I wish to make. Firstly, in terms of the current situation, which we're all very aware of, we've noted that the frequency of major social and economic changes has increased. We move from crisis to crisis. Now, that obviously has a very direct impact on development. It has an impact in terms of what funding is available to drive development, and it leads to more fundamental questions being asked about what is the nature of development. Perhaps in some cases even a redefinition which is taking place. So whilst we have the Millennium Development Goals, which is a normative standard, and all countries that subscribe need to move towards it, the trajectory to get there is something that becomes an issue of debate, given the fact that there are financial, social, and capacity constraints in various countries. These crises have led to a fundamental rethinking about what the model of development should be. When you have the US government bailing out the corporate sector, it's almost a flip side of sometimes the Washington consensus. And what does this now mean when you're going to have a similar approach taking place when a government has to bail out so-called independent states? And many of the hegemonies that we have held dear to ourselves and we have taught and we've believed as fact have now become challenged. And that then has an implication in terms of evaluation. Do we now wear the cap of being a professional, a technicist, independent, or do we get ourselves immersed into what are the social dynamics and politics around development? Because obviously that's where we come in as evaluators. The further issue around globalization is that the so-called divide between North and South is no longer a divide in those clear classic terms. And we have greater amounts of North and intra-South differentiation, pockets of excess in poor places and vice versa. And what does this all mean? There's greater amounts of differentiation. So it's not that easy to talk about the first world and the third world, the developed and the undeveloped, the North and the South, because you have this spread all over the show. And it's really about geography, it's about globalization. And sometimes when we make generalizations about places, we may be quite off target because we're looking at statistics and data that is generated with a particular mindset. And that obviously has implications in terms of development and in terms of how we go about measuring it. And the question that becomes very central in all of this is, would the technocratic solutions help to bring about, quite often, to solve problems that really are about governance? And we may want to rethink what we mean by development, what are the indicators, and how we go about doing it and measuring it. And in terms of us as evaluators, it places an onerous burden on us, because firstly, whilst we are joined through communities like IPDET, through IDEAS, in my country, SAMIA, on the continent, Africa, we share a passion, we have a community of practice, but when we go back to the cold face, we negotiate in very localized place with dynamics that are essentially quite political. So having the technical skills is important, but being able to negotiate this through a political terrain is something that's quite different. And in the countries and the regions that we live, it's not, things that are taken for granted are not that obvious. So whilst you may have a commitment in word on democracy and free speech, in practice it's often quite different, which has implications for evaluators as far as use goes. Also, the capacity to perform credible evaluation is influenced by political will. And this can change quite rapidly. You're dealing with situations that can be quite fickle. So even though you have a constitution in place and you have commitments, the actual practice, and oftentimes it shows in results not getting used. It's not just about how good what's the quality of the report. It's about the subtleties that go in ensuring that the reports do not go out because it could have political ramifications. It's something that we need to face quite openly, the political question around that. Further on, you could find that in a situation where you have evaluators, there's going to be greater impatience in that the users do not just want you to describe the problem, they want you to offer a solution. Now, we're all very good at describing. We can provide the graphs, etc. But can you give the solution? And that really quite fundamentally changes what we need to know and what skills we need to have and how well we need to be immersed in a situation. And questions that need to be asked is whether more monitoring and evaluation leads to better governance, and whether better governance translates into more effective development remains quite a fundamental question to my mind. Evaluators we need to ask ourselves the question, do they carry the baton of results and hand it over to the decision makers and stand back, I'm independent, don't trouble me, I've done my job? Or do they now become advocates? Do they take on a more political function? And that is something that is, it's a debate that is ongoing. And I would suggest that it's something that's going to, evaluators are going to be forced to start stating where they lie politically on lots of issues. So whilst the difference between the political and technical is going to become quite blurred. We evaluators are evaluators with the current training, are they positioned to diagnose and offer meaningful solutions? Can they negotiate the complex terrain between remaining independent and being operationally relevant? Is a question that I'm asked all the time when I do evaluation in South Africa. So what? You told us what the problem is, now give us the solution. Right? So just as much as you shout out and say this is what needs to be done, you're going to be shouted at. And even if you are an independent public service commission like we're proud of in South Africa, High Commissioner. The question is M&E the bedfellow of the opposition? What are the funding consequences? How close can the moth fly to the flame before it gets burnt? And can government-funded monitoring and evaluation really talk truth to power in a sustained manner? And this brings about the whole question of the NGO, the non-government community. To what role are they playing? We have found that in sub-Saharan Africa, much of the capacity of the NGO has been absorbed into government. And the NGO, the non-government sector, really is now working as consultants. So what has happened to the independence, the critical distance that one should have? On certification, I would say yes, most certainly, but it's down the road. The question that would be asked is, who is going to do the certification? What are going to be the norms and standards? Who makes the decisions on these? And are we there yet? It's a debate we're having in South Africa, and we're not there. We just want to get people to be evaluators and do it. Most certainly train them and capacitate them, and then move forward. Because these really are important questions, but it's these associations that are playing a fundamental role in building the capacity, even though they may not be certified for various reasons. So it's something we look forward to in terms of the future. And finally, on the last 2 points, on cabinet positions, we've got a Minister for Monitoring and Evaluation in South Africa, and it has helped to raise the profile of monitoring and evaluation. We do have the performance agreements of cabinet ministers now on the website, but it remains to be seen whether these statements of intent will be interrogated down the line. So I think it's important to have the political clout, the political will, but more important is to have champions and to have people within institutions really believe that doing monitoring and evaluation is important for democracy, and to drive it at that level than to symbolize it in terms of an appointee who can change quite quickly, because these are limited positions. In terms of the future, I think with M&E personnel, there's got to be greater multi-skilling. People would have to be able to negotiate the terrain, to get immersed, and have a whole range of communication, organizational, political skills in order to be savvy and in order to have an impact. This greater negotiation about place is likely to happen. So whilst we're going to have models, these have to be localized, and it comes back to the whole question and the debate around context. The partnership with Parliament and civil society must be strengthened, because without that, you're really going to have evaluators talking to themselves. And it is it's easy to become irrelevant when you really believe that you're important, and you don't get who monitors the evaluators. More collaboration beyond conferences by evaluators. Unfortunately, on our continent, between one Africa and the next, nothing much happens. We need to have more sustained, much more sustained, rather than these big bang symbolic approaches. Everyone feels good. 2 weeks later, everyone has forgotten, they're back to their normal work. And we have to be critical also with how we operate as evaluators. Initiatives that have been important in the South, the Association of African Public Service Commissions, which the South African Public Service Commission is leading, has brought together over 35 countries, the PSCs of Africa, to move them from recruitment and selection to do monitoring and evaluation, which we think will be a lot more relevant. And that remains to be seen. NEPAD needs to be strengthened, to bolstered. Not when you have a bad result, it all goes silent, as has happened. And civil society needs to be active in that. You can't have a new partnership for Africa development run by government to government, and then we don't hear anything about it. I think there's also going to be, in the next 10 years, a greater critique of North-led initiatives, but largely because capacity is building up in developing countries. So there's a greater confidence to engage and to want to engage. Not a critique and in rejection, but a critique in terms of how do you take the knowledge and localize it in a way that is actually relevant. And finally, the impact of the global financial crisis may shift the good governance emphasis, which right now focuses very much on democracy and financial governance, back to the whole question, the fundamental question which was asked decades ago of what is development? What does it mean? What are the elements of it? Let's redefine it. And what does it mean in terms of changing the lives of people? Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Naidoo. Without having to even tell you that there was 1 minute left, just on the dot. We'll have now Mr. Patton.
I think that the challenge I would offer before you as we think about the future is the extent to which we're actually prepared to deal with the complexities of development and therefore the complexities of evaluation as playing a role in evaluation. Among the many battles that are out there in the world, there's this macro battle about how the world has changed, that funders and international agencies and people dealing with these issues are involved in debate about. One perspective is that change occurs from the top down through the identification of effective models and disseminating those models throughout the world, taking them to scale so that philanthropic foundations like Gates and organizations like the World Bank are looking for models that have been validated and can be taken to scale. And they do that sometimes with randomized controlled trials that create fixed models. The competing way that the world changes is bottom-up adaptive management that engages local people in highly context-dependent development. These are quite contrasting ways of changing the world, models of change, and they involve fundamentally different approaches to evaluation. Top-down, model-based change does fidelity evaluation to make sure that people are adhering to the model. Bottoms-up change involves adaptive management and adaptive learning forms of change. And these are tensions within the field of development and tensions within the field of evaluation. What complexity opens up for us as a way of engaging this is to navigate the middle territory between top-down and bottom-up approaches, not being seduced by expert opinion and knowledge about what models may work without regard to context, but also not being seduced by the romantic notion that the locals have all the answers. It, in fact, puts the two into dialogue. What is learned at a more general level that can be applied at a local level, but requires adaptation on both parts. And in complex adaptive systems, there is that kind of adaptive learning that goes on. An example that has just recently hit the news was about Bill Gates' trip to Africa to look at the effects of their now billion-dollar investment in polio. And some of you may have seen the news about that trip. We appeared to be on the verge 2 years ago of eradicating polio. It's been narrowly targeted, celebrated, hopefully, as the next disease after smallpox to be eradicated worldwide. And in the last 2 years, instead of polio being eradicated, it's broken out in new countries. It's reemerged in a number of countries. And as Gates made a trip throughout Africa and looked at what was going on, part of what they found in systems terms was that the campaign to eradicate polio sucked resources from the health system into that one campaign, weakened the rest of the health systems, made people more vulnerable who, being vulnerable and sicker, were more vulnerable to polio. So that the very concentrated attention on a single outcome indicator distorted the rest of the system, making people and the health systems in general more vulnerable, and led to the opposite of the desired outcome. That's a complex dynamic system result. If you Google Bill Gates and polio, you get that story. And the Gates Foundation is now having to re-examine their narrow targeted performance outcome approach to look at more of of a systems understanding of how these things are interrelated. Complexity is about that. It's about acknowledging the uncertainties that we face, the ways that things suddenly happen, like the emergence of the H1N1 virus, where suddenly in a place like Mexico, everything changes. And the Mexican economy took a huge hit. That wasn't in anybody's development plan. I happened to be in South Africa right early in the HIV/AIDS epidemic doing training. We had 400 people from every sector: forest fighters, police, criminal justice, health, education, economic development, microfinance. And what struck me at that point was that in every one of those programs and organizations, everybody was involved in HIV/AIDS, and that had not been a part of anybody's strategic plan. But the firefighters were involved in distributing information about AIDS. The people working in forests were involved, both for their own employees and for the people in the villages around there. These are complex dynamic systems that suggest that the tunnel vision that evaluation has contributed to by supporting the narrow identification of performance indicators that we look at with blinders and don't look at what's going on in the larger systems is one of the challenges. Let me close by saying that a part of this is, I think, one of the dirty little secrets in evaluations past that I hope that we overcome in the future, is that we have acknowledged in our training and in our work that it's important to attend to unanticipated consequences and to emergent effects. But that has been nothing more than lip service. You rarely see an actual evaluation that has done any real field work to look for unintended consequences. A performance indicators-based system only measures whether or not performance was attained around those identified objectives. It takes a different form of engagement to turn up unanticipated consequences. You have to go out and do field work, where the action is, what's actually going on, because you don't even know what may have happened. And one of the weaknesses of what we have done has been not to take these complex nonlinear dynamics seriously. And I think that part of the future of evaluation is to engage more deeply and in a realer way with the complex realities of development.